Good afternoon, and welcome to the Transition Readiness series. My name is Patrick Shepard. Thank you for joining us. Today we're going to be talking about a transition topic that you may have not really thought about. It's not something that we emphasize heavily when we're preparing for the transition, and that is training of our career senior executive service members. Generally, when we think about transition, we think about political appointees, looking for new jobs, leaving the government, requiring post-employment counseling, and a new class of appointees coming in after the election, and all that comes with that: nominee financial disclosure, new ethics orientation, all of those kinds of things. But today we wanted to take a few minutes to share with you some tools that you can use to prepare your career SES employees for the presidential transition, because there are a couple of situations they may find themselves in that they might not have been in for the past few years, or if they're new to the SES, maybe never before. And there are some easy training tools that we can utilize to prepare them for those situations. So what we're going to do today is share with you some objectives for ethics training in general, and especially the models that we're going to use today. We're going to show you three kinds of tools that you can use. One is a sort of handout, an easy thing that you could just email out to some of your colleagues at your agency who it might be helpful to. One is a scenario-based activity that you could spend a few minutes in a staff meeting, an executive meeting, or other gathering of employees to discuss some issues they might face. And the third model is a case study model. And we've provided all of these tools to you on the Max page, so you can download them. They're in a format that you can save them. You can adapt them to your own needs. They're all editable documents. So if you'd like to insert some agency-specific language, you're welcome to do so. And we'd encourage you to. We suggest these as models that you can use, but we don't presume to imagine every circumstance or every individual case that you might need to use them for. So please do use them as models, and feel free to adapt them to your agency's needs. And if you do so, and you'd like to share those with your colleagues, you can do them through the Institute for Ethics in Government store on the max.gov page. So we're going to start by talking about some objectives, and then we're going to go through some examples that you might be able to put to work sort of right away. And this is something we don't have to wait for the election to begin talking about. And as we enter kind of the calm before the storm through the end of the fiscal year, this is something that you can put to work now. So I'm going to take just a second to pull up the slides, and then we can get into the tools. So again, welcome to Training Tools for the Career SES. And let's start off with some of our objectives of training. And what we like to do when we're doing employee training, so not training for ethics officials, but for employees who come to work every day, who just want to stay out of trouble and make sure they understand what they can and can't do under the ethics rules. We have three categories of objectives that we like to focus on. And the first objective is something that you might not focus on a great deal in your current ethics training and ethics briefings. And that's the ability to identify low-risk conduct, or things that really don't pose an ethics problem. I think as ethics officials, we spend a lot of time telling people what they can't do. Say, you shouldn't do this, you can't do that, you can't accept gifts from these people, you should ask us before doing the following things. But I think something we really want to do is define for our employees areas where they're safe from any concern under the ethics rules, or where there's relatively low risk. And I think this is a good place to start, inquiring where employees think that they don't have any ethics concerns, because something that we really want to do is calibrate the intuition of our employees to the ethics rules. The ethics rules aren't always intuitive, and there are places where an intuitive understanding of ethics might be counterproductive for the employee who is trying to conform to the standards if they just use their intuition. So what we want to do here is get a sense of where they think there aren't going to be any problems. So our first objective is to identify low-risk conduct, areas where employees don't think they need the assistance of the ethics program, and find out if that actually comports with their responsibilities under the laws and regulations. Our second objective is to find out and to explore the areas of conduct that are just prohibited. They're high risk or prohibited conduct. They're things that we should never do. This is a good question to ask employees. What is something in this circumstance that you would never do, that you understand to be absolutely prohibited? And we want to sort of inquire and find out intuitively, or from their understanding of the ethics rules, what they find to be in that category of prohibited conduct. And another thing we want to do here is talk about how to avoid that conduct. in many cases, it's easy to identify and say that, this is I identify this as a problem. But in some circumstances, we'll see when we get into some of the scenarios and the tools, you'll find that actually avoiding that conduct can be a little challenging. Sometimes there are social pressures in the other direction. Sometimes there are institutional pressures that move someone towards prohibited conduct. And we want to sort of explore that and talk about that when we're doing face-to-face training with employees. So this is our second objective: find the other extreme. What are those things that we never want to do? And do we have the tools to make sure that we don't engage in that conduct? And perhaps the most important objective is the third one: finding those areas where an employee should seek our guidance as ethics officials before they act. So in this case, can they identify those places where they're close to the rule, where they want to be careful, where they might want to receive clearance or advice before proceeding? So this is sort of the complicated middle in our spectrum of government service. And we want to make sure that our employees can sense when they're getting close to the line, and maybe more importantly, be able to access help in those cases. And that seems simple. We say, well, we provide them with our contact information. But if this kind of situation arises during the course of a single conversation, during a meeting, or some other ongoing activity, sometimes it can be difficult for someone to extricate themselves from that situation in order to pause and receive the advice they need to proceed. So we want to focus both on the ability to identify conduct where you might need some assistance, but also the real skills, the material life skills, to be able to access that help when you need it. And that sort of raises a bigger point of what we're trying to do when we train employees. And something that I really like to do when I'm training a new group of employees is really put myself in their shoes and imagine their day. From the moment they walk through the door at the agency, the kinds of work they might encounter, and find those places where they might bump up against the ethics rules, and try and imagine those, sort of really vividly imagine them and how they actually occur. It's one thing to tell people the rules, but to imagine how they're actually going to encounter situations that bring the rules into play is really important. So that's kind of where we want to start from, is how they actually experience their work, how they experience their role in the workplace, and how these issues really come up for them, so that we can help them be able to identify when they need help, and also give them the skills they need to be able to access that help when they require it. So those are our three major objectives when we're doing training with employees. We want them to be able to identify areas when they're good to go, when they don't need help, when they are not likely to have any problem under the ethics rules. We want them to be able to identify those things they should never do and be able to avoid that kind of conduct. And in the middle, we want them to be able to identify when they require assistance and be able to get that assistance in the circumstances that they're likely to find themselves in. So that's kind of what we're going to be talking about today. And from a trainer's perspective, I find this tool to be very, very helpful. Here we've labeled it the ethics continuum. And when we're doing scenario-based ethics training, I find this to be very helpful to ask employees for a set of proposed conduct, or a kind of proposed conduct, where they would put this on the ethics continuum. Would they say that helping a friend is absolutely permissible in some case? Would they say that stealing government property is absolutely prohibited? Sort of use this to help gauge both where they believe the lines of prohibited conduct fall, and to help them to calibrate their intuitive understanding to the requirements of the ethics law and regulation. And as we go through the scenario, I'm going to show you how we use this in the classroom. But I find it to be a very, very helpful tool, and it's something that as instructors we can go back to again and again and again, so that we can sort of explore and exhaust the possible avenues of activity that come from a given scenario. So I want to keep that in mind. And this is kind of the process that we've developed for delivering scenario-based education. And this is just for one of the three kinds of training that we're going to be talking about today. And this might be familiar. This is some of the tools that we shared back in January with the library of 10 tools. This is the process that I go through to interrogate and work through a scenario with a group of employees. And this may be helpful to you. This is obviously not the only way that you can attack scenario-based learning, but I find it kind of useful to think of because it keeps me on track. Sometimes with scenarios, we become worried that the the conversation is going to go off track somewhere, and we're going to end up somewhere we didn't want to go. So we want to do two things. We want to focus on our objectives, identifying conduct that is okay, that is prohibited, and where we need help. We want to make sure we're moving in the direction of finding the answers to those questions. And we also want to have an idea of how we progress through a scenario, how we find out about where our participants are, and help them to calibrate their intuition with the ethics rules. So when we begin with a scenario, and we'll look at a few in a minute, the first question I like to ask is, what would you do, or what could we do? What are the possible actions that we could take given this scenario? What are the courses of action from a given scenario? Say we said you're asked to serve on a source selection. Okay, I'm asked to serve on the source selection as an employee. What could I do? Well, there are many things that we could do from there. We could run out of the office. We could decide to participate in the source selection. We could ask our boss why we're being assigned. We could talk to an ethics counselor. There are literally infinite possibilities from that scenario. And something I like to do to try and structure that conversation is to go back to that continuum and say, what's something here that we could do where we wouldn't have any concerns under the ethics rules? What would make us feel safe in that case, that we wouldn't have any possibility of problems in the scenario? And in the case you're asked to participate in a source selection, it could be maybe I'm not gonna. Then we could ask another question. We could say, what would be prohibited conduct? What's something that we could do in the context of a source selection that would be absolutely prohibited, that we think is sort of intuitively and obviously wrong? And an employee might offer an example such as share non-public information or the criteria for the selection with one of the possible bidders. So there you get kind of a sense of where your employees are, so where they understand the prohibited conduct to be, where they understand conduct that would be fine to be. Then we could also ask, where would you maybe want to get help? And an employee might volunteer that, maybe if their spouse worked for one of the contractors, they want to get advice before proceeding. So we could sort of plot a number of possibilities on the spectrum. And I like to try and get one where the room feels that they'd be very comfortable, that you're not going to have a problem. One area that they feel is absolutely prohibited, and one area or more where they'd want to get advice. And I like to plot those on the ethics continuum. Here at OGE, we do that on a whiteboard or a flip chart, something like that. We can just write them courses A, B, C, and D. And then we can start to apply the rules. So now that we've understood sort of intuitively, or we've taken the temperature of the room to find out how they intuitively understand the possible ways to progress, we can take one of those and examine it in light of the rules. And we've shared with you a supplement to annual ethics training. It's a handbook that contains summaries of the standards, the conflict of interest laws, and a place for you to put any supplemental regulations. And you can use that as a tool to help people look at the proposed courses of action in light of the rules and to see if any of those might apply to the situation. Where you have agreement between the requirements under the ethics rules and the intuition of your participants, you can emphasize that. You can point out the ways in which the rules conform to their kind of common sense or pre-existing understanding. Likewise, where you have discord between their feelings about whether something should be permissible or is permissible and the requirements of the rules, you can emphasize that. That's probably where you want to put the majority of your training energy, is in correcting misapprehensions. So if your group of participants have placed a particular avenue of conduct in the green section of the ethics continuum, and that's actually prohibited, that's a place where you probably want to emphasize the role of the rule. And then we can do that for each of the options. So we can look at the first proposed course of action, interrogate the course of action that they thought was very safe, and either confirm that the ethics rules wouldn't prohibit that activity or correct any misapprehensions. Do the same for those areas where they think they would need the assistance or they're unsure. And then finally look at the rules that would prohibit any conduct that they think are absolutely prohibited. And we just keep going round and round until you've exhausted each of those possibilities, or a reasonable number, so that you have a sense that people can do those three things: identify conduct that is permissible, identify conduct that is absolutely prohibited, and identify that area in which they will need assistance before proceeding. So this is kind of just the general way that we try and work through a scenario with a group of participants. And I showed this sort of as background before we look at the scenarios, because the scenarios, when we look at them, we're going to look very broad. You're going to say, I don't see the ethics question here yet. And this is the process we use to sort of uncover the ethics questions that might arise. So the first scenario that we're going to talk about deals with communicating with former colleagues. So this is where we get into one of the two areas that we're concerned about with our career SES folks. And that is, how do you navigate conversations and relationships with colleagues who have left the agency? So maybe your former boss is a political appointee, and he or she has left the government now and is working in the private sector. And how do you manage that relationship to avoid your own problems as a government servant, as a government employee, and also, help your former colleagues to navigate sort of the post-employment world? How can we be sensitive to that? So we're going to look at a scenario in a minute that's going to help us get at some of these questions and think about what kind of conduct is fine, what kind of conduct is absolutely prohibited, where we need help, with an emphasis on giving people the practical skills to be able to conform to those requirements. But as instructors, we really need to know where we want to go. What are our objectives with this scenario? And I think in this case, they're fairly simple. We want to communicate that maintaining a purely social relationship with former colleagues is permissible. We want to communicate that there are certain areas where you want to consult with the ethics office before proceeding. In this case, if you want to discuss any government business, we should probably have a conversation about the applicability of the post-employment restrictions, the ability of the government to reach out to a former colleague, those kinds of things. We want to be careful about inviting former colleagues back to the agency to share maybe some expertise, some institutional knowledge that we failed to capture. We want to proceed with caution there. And we want our employees to understand that they should seek the help of the ethics office before seeking advice or special expertise from the former colleagues. And at the other end of our continuum, we want to make sure that employees understand they should not share non-public information with their former colleagues, and they should not provide preferential access or treatment. So this is kind of the goal. When we have constructed our continuum with our participants, this is where we want to get to. We want to sort of plot these 6 data points on the continuum and calibrate their understanding so they understand that this where the middle is and where the extremes are. It's very helpful for ethics officials for us to write this down, because then when we open up the scenario for general questions or general comments, when we ask people what could they do, we know where we're trying to go. We know the kinds of areas that we want to explore and interrogate using the process that we just displayed. So let's take a look at the scenario. So you'll notice a couple of things about this scenario. The scenario is your former boss, a political appointee, has taken a job with a government affairs firm. She calls you at your desk. We don't have a perfectly formed legal fact pattern here. We don't have a slam dunk 207 violation that's occurred yet. We don't even know if there's really going to be an ethics question here. But what we have is a situation where an employee might find him or herself. This is a scenario that is presented in the way that the employee is likely to experience it. It's very easy to picture an employee sitting at his or her desk, the phone rings, to pick up the phone, it's their former boss. Okay, so from here, remembering what we're trying to do, we're trying to identify that kind of activity that's permissible, that you don't need the assistance of the ethics office. You want to identify the conduct that is prohibited, and you want to identify those areas where you're going to need help before proceeding. And importantly, we are going to need the skills to access help where we need it and avoid conduct that might violate one of the standards or one of the conflict of interest laws. So you can see here, this is kind of tricky, right? Because the employee, from their perspective, they're in an ethics situation at this juncture, but they don't know where it's going to go. And there are some social pressures that are going to maybe complicate their ability to avoid prohibited conduct or seek help where they need it, because they might need to seek help right now during this phone call. So I would start as a facilitator here by asking what people think would be a fine topic of conversation, something that they would have no reservations about discussing with their former boss. And I give them some time to think about it. That's something that's very challenging to do in this case. As an instructor, it feels like an eternity after we pose that kind of question. But you really need to give people some time to think, and be patient and try not to proceed without getting those responses, especially early on in the class. So say, what could we do here? What is something that we would be very comfortable talking to our former colleague about that wouldn't raise any ethics concerns? And I suspect someone in your class might volunteer something like, I think we could have a social conversation, or we could talk about our children or our families, things that are unrelated to work. That's a great suggestion. So we could plot that on our ethics continuum. We could take that course of action, purely social discussion about our families or interests we share outside of work, and we could place that on the green end of the ethics continuum, something that we as a group or your class understands to be permissible. Next question we might ask is, what is something that you would be very careful not to do? What's something here that you would be sure to avoid discussing with your former boss? You might wait for a little longer in this case because people, might want to think this through a little bit. They might say, we don't want to share non-public information. We don't want to share secrets or inside information that wouldn't be available to the public. Okay, we could plot that on the continuum. We could ask, what would make you nervous? What would you feel uncomfortable discussing, but you're not sure about? And you might get all sorts of things. People might ask, well, what if they were just calling to ask, if they left a file somewhere, or for someone's telephone number, or they were wondering if someone still worked for the agency. So there might be all sorts of things in the middle that we could explore. And from there, we could take each of those and take the room's sort of feelings about where they should be placed on the ethics continuum, whether or not they feel they are absolutely prohibited, permissible, or we're not sure, and explore them in light of the post-employment rules. We could explore them in light of the requirements of subpart G of the standards for the given employee. We could look at appearance considerations. We could sort of explore all of those permutations until we've kind of exhausted it and gotten to at least to our goals here. And our goals are to make sure people understand they can have social conversations, that when they're discussing business or need something for an employee, that they understand those are things where they might need assistance before proceeding, and they understand the hard prohibitions on sharing non-public information or providing preferential access. So we could get to those through this scenario. Something else I like to do, especially with scenarios like this, is talk about how you comply with those standards. This is an awkward situation. You're on the telephone. Your former boss says to you, I was just wondering if you guys think that report is going to come out in the next few days, or are you still taking comments on that regulation? So they might introduce some a scenario that causes us discomfort under the rules. And it's one thing to be able to understand that discussion is prohibited by the rules, or may be prohibited by the rules. It's another thing to be able to get off of the telephone. So in this case, I've used this with employees, and something that we like to do is to role play this conversation. As the facilitator, you can imagine that you're the former boss, and you can imagine this sort of uncomfortable conversation with a former colleague, and I'll allow participants to practice steering the conversation in the social direction. Practice saying, I'm not sure if we can talk about that. I need to check, but I'll give you a call back either way. We can give people some strategies. So we like to focus both on the ability to identify where you are on the continuum, but also on the sort of real skills that you need to be able to apply that knowledge. So this is one example of a scenario that you could use in a staff meeting or any other meeting with folks who might be in this situation. And it probably will take you 10 or 15 minutes to explore the common possibilities, and you can understand those learning objectives that are in the handout. And something we've done for you is we've provided those one-page handouts as a separate document, so you can print those out and at the end of class hand those out, so folks can take them with them and remember that these are areas that they want to be cautious. These are things they can do, and these are things that they should avoid. So this is one example of a way that you can look at some of these issues that come up with our folks during the transition period when they're dealing with former colleagues. So again, we plot those things on the ethics continuum and then go through them and look at them in light of the rules, and we can use that supplement in the handbook to provide employees with a better understanding of where they might look and what the rules require, and that's another resource they can take with them to reference as they're going through their work. So next, we'd like to share with you another format that you can use for training with managers or other groups of employees. This is a little bit more involved. If you have more time with your employees, this is something that you can use, but it's another strategy for getting to sort of similar objectives. And we call these strategic foresight exercises. And what they really are business case studies. They're modeled on the business case study model. And they allow employees an opportunity to see themselves in a situation, spend some time working with colleagues to imagine how they would handle the situation. One of the nice things about these kind of exercises is that they provide context for the ethics situations. It's unusual for an employee to encounter an ethics question or an ethics scenario in isolation. Right. Usually there's some management context, maybe some performance context. There's always some sort of personal context around the scenario. And using these foresight exercises allows us to provide an ethics scenario with all of that context and allow employees to think about and work through it as really a business problem in addition to an ethics problem, and to think about how they will use the ethics office or other resources available to them to help resolve the situation. So here we just have a simple, one-page exercise that you could hand out to a group of 2 or 3 employees, and you could give them, 20 minutes, half an hour, 15 minutes to look through it and sort of work through. So let's take a look here. So the background here is that you're a career SES in charge of a division at your agency. Your boss, a political appointee, has left the agency, and you have been assigned to act in her stead. You are now responsible for 2 teams in addition to your normal divisions. So this is a situation that might occur for any number of our career SES leaders. They may be asked to be responsible for a larger group or oversee a larger group of employees, or to fill in as the leader for some other divisions. And here we have the challenge. One of the teams you oversee is primarily charged with overseeing a contract. And this challenge you could tailor to your own agency. If this is not a realistic scenario for you, you could put in a challenge that is realistic for your agency. But in this case, we're going to say that one of the teams is primarily charged with overseeing a contract. Many contractor personnel are on site and working closely with the employees on the agency team. Now, that's a fact that someone might observe. It doesn't immediately ring ethics alarm bells. The team is generally very successful at delivering work product on time and under budget. This is an interesting management fact. It's a performance fact that someone might look at as they took over for a new team. However, you've noticed some troubling goings on in the way they conduct business. You've observed government team members socializing with contractor personnel, both during work and after hours, employees and contractor personnel arriving late and leaving early, as well as a lot of extracurricular activities in the workplace. In fact, they've invited you to join their fantasy sports league. They're holding their draft this Friday at 2 p.m. in the main conference room. The invitation suggests that this will be the first in a series of such events. So you could sort of see how this is a more complicated than a simple ethics question. There's a lot of stuff going on here. There's a culture that appears to be delivering results. There are some management issues in the area of maybe time and attendance and contract performance. There are some obvious to us, maybe ethics issues with misuse of government property and time. There may be some gifts issues that we can't see. But all of this is together in the scenario. And we could ask our employees then to work through this scenario. So they could work together to identify the individual challenges. So, not just the ethics challenges, but also the manager. What do we think the problems are here? Do we have any strategies? Do we understand the resources available? And then we can discuss it. So in this case, as the facilitator, I'd just sit back, maybe stop by each group a couple of times over the 15 or 20 minutes you give them to work through this, and then have a discussion. See if your managers know about the resources available through the ethics office. See if sort of how they would approach this problem, and use it as an opportunity to share any advice that you may have, or support that you could provide in this kind of situation. So you can talk about these challenges in the context that they might occur, and you can talk about them as not just an individual conduct situation, but really an agency problem that may take a team approach to solve. So this is another model that you're free to use. We've provided this in a Microsoft Word document format. If these facts don't fit your agency, certainly, feel free to change the facts to a scenario that does fit with your agency. And I think one of the things we like about this is when we're training managers, supervisors, and leaders, this puts them in the position of being managers, supervisors, and leaders, and shows how we as ethics officials can support them in those roles, and how the ethics rules really are an input to some of their decision making in their primary role as manager, supervisor, or leader. So these are another way that you can explore these issues. And this gets to one of those common situations where you have folks who are acting in a capacity as a result of vacancies amongst the political ranks. And here we have another one-pager, which might help us to see what kinds of objectives we might have when we're talking to senior executive service employees who have been assigned to act in a new role. And things we want them to consider is if new duties might pose a conflict of interest. We also want them to be sensitive to any ethics obligations of their new subordinates. So if they're acting in a supervisory role for new employees, find out if those folks have any recusal obligations or other ethics concerns that their supervisor needs to be mindful of. And that's a question, if supervisors remember to ask, all the better for us. And this is a way we can encourage them to do so. We want them to consult the ethics office to let us know if they have new duties, right? We're probably going to review their financial disclosure reports or periodic transaction reports. And we can only provide complete conflicts advice if we understand the scope of their duties. If there's any change brought about by the acting status that might change their financial disclosure status, or they're concerned about that, they should consult the ethics office. And also to update any recusals. So if you have people who have active ethics obligations, they may need to change or expand the number of gatekeepers that are used in those recusals. So something else for people to keep in mind. Another thing we want people to be mindful of is not to act if they think they have a conflict of interest. When we get new work, that's one way we can come to new conflicts of interest, as well as if we have new financial holdings. I think employees tend to be very sensitive to the conflicts posed by new financial situations, but new duties maybe don't set off those alarm bells quite as loudly. So this is something we could emphasize when talking about being assigned to a new role. So what I'd like to do now is take a look at another simple scenario, not a case study, but one like we looked at with the phone call from the former colleague, that we could use to interrogate these issues. So again, these are going to be our goals, is to get these kinds of courses of action plotted on the continuum when discussing someone's assignment to act in a new role. So let's take a look at this scenario. So here's our scenario. Your boss leaves the agency. You're asked to act in her stead. It's an enormously broad question. If we start with our first question, which is, what is something that we think would be absolutely permissible in this case? What do we think would be a concern? We might struggle a little bit because I don't think a lot of our employees are going to notice right away any sort of ethics considerations here. They have lots of considerations. It's a very broad situation to be placed in. So what I'd like to do as a facilitator in a case like this is just ask people what they might do next. What would maybe be the first thing you would do when you're asked to act in a new position that's maybe senior or more expansive than your current position? And I suspect you'll get a lot of answers, but some of them will center around getting to know new subordinates and getting to know the work that any new groups of employees are doing. I bet most of the orientation type questions that you receive center around one of those two areas. And both of those will help us get to those three objectives that we just looked at on our spectrum. So if we started with, I'd like to get to know the work of the new divisions for which I'm responsible. I think that's a perfectly normal and probably likely response that you will get as a facilitator. And we probably don't have enough information at that juncture to plot that piece of work on the ethics continuum. So I might ask, well, what concerns do you have when you have new work? Or another question you could ask is if someone could explain in just sort of plain language what a conflict of interest is. And the goal here would be to emphasize that when we have new duties, we have new concerns about conflicts of interest. We could pose a follow-on hypothetical here. So, say you learn that one of the new divisions that you're responsible for does business with your spouse's employer. Where would you plot that activity on the ethics continuum? And hopefully they'd say, well, I'm not sure if that poses a conflict necessarily, but I'd like to get advice, so we could plot that in the middle. So we could, from that one scenario, look at the possible ethics implications of new work and approach that through the vein of someone being assigned to act and learning about that new work, and at what point during that learning process might they need to approach the ethics office for advice, and what are the indicia that would require them to do so? How do they know when they need advice? The other area that we could explore is getting to know new subordinates. They might suggest they'd like to have a meeting with each of their subordinates. And there we could talk about, ethics issues that come from supervising new folks. In this case, I think our primary goal is going to be to find out if there are any ethics obligations that you need to be aware of for each of your subordinates. So if you're having one-on-ones, a question that you might ask as a supervisor is, do you have any active recusals that I need to be aware of so I don't assign you conflicting work? And again, we could get here by asking people to explain their understanding of a conflict of interest, and maybe talking about what their role is in helping subordinates avoid conflicts of interest. So as we start from that very broad situation, the way an employee would experience it, we're beginning to sensitize them to those trip points in that process where they're going to need ethics advice or the support of the ethics program, or where they might run into conduct that is simply prohibited. Let's see. So hopefully you'll find these tools to be very helpful as you train your career SES in preparation for the transition. And again, we like to offer a spectrum of tools that you can use. The two handouts that just have the simple do's, don'ts, and be careful of are very easy things to share with a group of employees. You could share them attached to an email. You could share them in a staff meeting. You could provide them to employees in person if they stop by your office to talk about, any of these things are simple takeaways. If you have some time to discuss with folks, the simple scenarios where we use the ethics continuum, they only take between 5 and 15 minutes each. So if you have a couple minutes at the beginning of a senior staff meeting, you can use these scenarios to explore the issues people might find and to help them navigate those and know when they need to seek advice, when they're in the clear, and when they should, those areas they should really stay away from. And finally, we have that business case study foresight exercise model. So if you have areas where you have real concern, or you have a management problem that you think is likely to occur that you really want to explore with a group of employees, that's a really appropriate tool. So hopefully these tools, while we're only looking at a handful of issues, give you a variety of strategies that you can put to work at an appropriate level for the folks as they prepare for transition. So I'd like to open it up for any questions that folks might have. If you're on the Hangout and you have a question or a comment, you can type it at the lower right-hand corner of your screen, and I will open up the phones as well.
At this time, if you'd like to ask a question, please press star then 1 on your phone's keypad. Please unmute your phone and record your name when prompted.
But yeah, we do appreciate you joining us, and we will be back next month with 2 more presentations in our Transition Readiness series. We hope to discuss some new guidance from the Office of Management and Budget on enterprise risk management and internal controls, and the role of the ethics program in those processes. And we're also going to discuss briefings for new leadership. So when those new leaders do come on board after the election, we want to talk about some strategies that you can employ to brief them and some considerations as you prepare for those briefings. I'm not showing any questions on the Hangout. Do we have any questions on the phone?
We do not at this time, sir.
Okay, excellent. Well, thank you guys all very much for joining us, and we do hope you'll join us again next month. And if you put these tools to work or adjust them to fit your agencies, please let us know how it goes. And if they work very well and you'd like to share them with your colleagues, you can get in touch with us and we'd be happy to share them on the Institute for Ethics in Government store. So until next time, I'm Patrick Shepard.
Thank you for your participation.